It's not a teleprompter, even though I do have a teleprompter at work, but it's not a teleprompter. It's so I can see what's behind me, because I could see it out of the corner of my eye when it was in the corner kind of illegally there, but I can't see it at all behind my back, so now I can keep an eye on it. This morning, we began what I think, well, it may be a 4-part lesson, because I might try to go a little bit short so Mom doesn't have to sit so long tonight. It is good to see her out. I told her I couldn't use her as my example as much as I was. Now that if she's here, she'll get after me. But this morning we began talking about Christians and morality and how the world views it and how the Bible views it, or how it should view it, and how we handle it. And I listed off several sins, and as I was thinking about that this afternoon, I didn't want to come across as those sins are worse than any other. All sins are equally bad. Those are just very easy examples for us to look to as how society's view has changed with them. Nothing more on those sins than another, but we have changed as a culture how we feel about those. And that creeps into us, it creeps into how we feel about it, and it creeps into how the church looks at it as a whole. Things that were never spoken of, never even thought of, are now commonplace. So as we're confronted with morality, what do we use as our guide? Well, many people use their feelings. That's what, did I mess that up? No, see, I can't read it backwards, though. I can tell when it clicks, but I can't read it. They use their feelings to guide them. And if it feels right, then it must be right. But that's not what the scriptures tell us. Proverbs there tells us in Proverbs 14 and verse 12, there's a way that seems right to a man, but the end is the way of death. Our feelings are going to get us in trouble when we follow them. It's not up to us to guide ourselves. That's what Jeremiah 10 and verse 23 says. We see these fruits of that in our world right now. Man guiding himself, and we're just making a mess of it. Close to our feelings is our conscience. Many people think if their conscience is clear, then they're going to be okay. But when we look at Paul as an example of that, Paul did all kinds, as much damage as he could to Christians in the cause of Christ, and he did that with a clear conscience, even to the point of torturing them and putting them to death, dragging them from their homes because of their faith, consenting to the death of Stephen, and very well could have been there shouting in that mob to crucify Jesus. The time, the location, everything with Paul, he could have been in that mob scene there as well, and did it with a clear conscience. We cannot trust our conscience. Other people look to their friends and think if everyone else is doing it, it must be okay. I tried to use this excuse growing up a lot. Well, all my friends are doing it. Why can't I do it? It didn't fly very well. And I'll tell you the response that I got, and almost every time I brought it up was, well, if everyone else jumped off a bridge, would you? That was what they said back. And that's usually where the discussion ended, because that excuse or that reason for doing something wasn't going to fly. But when we consider the words of Jesus in describing the end of the majority, in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, we looked at this verse last week or the week before, but the majority is not going to find heaven. In fact, the scriptures would say that there are few that will be saved according to Jesus. In Matthew chapter 7 and beginning in verse 13, he says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it." Think of those, and we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, the safety in numbers. We think about safety being in numbers. Just because we're in agreement does not mean that everyone around us is right. And we can follow the majority in doing wrong. Just because there's a lot of people, just because we vote on something and 65 or 70% or 80%, even if 100%, or 99.9% agreed that something it should be done this way, that does not always make it right. We have several examples of that in the scriptures. We can see that the majority of the people in the time of Noah perished in the flood. And I believe that we looked at most of these verses last week or 2 weeks ago with our lesson, but in 1 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 20, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20, it says, who formerly were disobedient when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. All that time that Noah spent preaching and building the ark and talking to the people that came by, in only his wife, his sons, and their wives. That was it. Now, I don't know the exact population of the world at that time, but I'm confident it was more than 8. And what did we learn back in Genesis chapter 6 when this started? God saw the world, and with the exception of Noah, the thoughts of the world were on evil continually. The entire world, except for those 8 souls, you know they were not the majority. Thinking about our world today, continually on evil. And just when we think it can't get worse, well, we can wait just a few more hours and it will. On evil continually. When I saw the events of Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and then see some of the comments on social media about it with what happened because of that man. Imagine somebody having so much hate in his heart, like father, like son. The criminal was taught by the father. And because he didn't like what happened when his son pointed a gun at police, he then run over a police officer. I mean, can we get any lower as a society? How long can we, in our human thinking, how long can God allow that to continue? But a lot of people think that's okay. And they're in support of that man. They're in support of the man that shot the insurance agent in the back in New York because of how our healthcare system is. That's okay, just kill him. If we don't like it, on evil continually. Is the majority right? How about with Lot and the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? Lot and his family was not in the majority. In Genesis chapter 18 there, verses 22 through 33. And when we read about Sodom and Gomorrah, they sound eerily familiar to our society today. And how the people in that city were living. And what they did when the angels came to Lot's house to warn him. That was a thriving city. That's why Lot chose to move close to it. Because they had the well-watered plains for his cattle, and it was going to be a good place to live, probably very convenient for him. But when God told Abraham that he was going to destroy the city, Abraham went and interceded on their behalf to try to convince God to relent from that destruction. In Genesis chapter 18 and beginning in verse 22, there, Genesis 18 and verse 22, then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. And Abraham came near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? So the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. Then Abraham answered and said, indeed now, who am I but dust and ashes, have taken it up on myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose there were 5 less than the 50 righteous. Would you destroy all the city for lack of 5? So he said, if I find there 45, I will not destroy it. And he spoke to him yet again and said, suppose there should be 40 found there. So he said, I will not do it for the sake of 40. Then he said, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 should be found there. So he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, indeed now, I have taken it up on myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 should be found there. So he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 20. Then he said, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak but once more. Suppose 10 should be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Look at the progression. Let's start with 50. Let's think about the city of Hamilton. Could we find 50? In thinking about this congregation, where's there another Church of Christ in the county? Could we find I think it's close to 1 million. It may be a little over 500,000, but Butler County is a pretty good sized county. Could we find 50 in it? I think Mill Road's just in Hamilton County. They're probably the closest congregation to it. Could we find 50? Could you find 30? Could you find 20? Just down to 10. They couldn't be found there. And how many escaped? Wasn't it at 3 at the end? Because we had Lot, his 2 daughters, and his wife left, but she looked back and didn't make it out any further. No safety was found in numbers there. They were wiped off the face of the earth because they were so evil. And these were bigger cities, but they were full of sin. There was no safety found with their friends in the majority. How about in the days of Joshua? We would have perished in the wilderness with them. Think of the times the majority was in the wrong there. Not one, save these 2, of the ones that left Egypt entered the promised land. An entire generation passed because the majority were in disobedience. And from the 12 spies being sent out, how many came back? When they spied the land, how many of them came back and said, we can take it? Well, there was 2. 2 of the 12. The rest of them were over in the corner cowering in fear. We're like grasshoppers compared to them. They didn't factor in that the Lord was on their side, that he had promised to give them that land. How many of the original ones entered Canaan? Joshua and Caleb. It's pretty easy to remember. The majority of them fell in the wilderness along the way. Not the crowd that I want to be in, is it? In Numbers chapter 32, beginning in verse 11. Numbers chapter 32 and beginning in verse 11. Surely none of the men who came up from Egypt, from 20 years old and above, shall see the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they have not wholly followed me, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and the Kenizzite, and Joshua, the son of Nun, for they have wholly followed the Lord. So the Lord's anger was aroused against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years, until all the generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was gone. All those children of Israel that left the captivity in Egypt did not make it to the promised land because they were doing evil in the sight of God. The majority of them missed that land that had been promised to them because of their disobedience, the same as we will miss heaven with the majority following our friends or family, if that's who we're going to look to for our moral guidance. The majority is not safe. We should know that because we're told that we're going to be corrupted through evil companions. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33, it says evil communications or company or companionship. That's going to affect us negatively. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33, it says, "Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits." I like the English Standard Version's rendering of this. It says, "Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals." That was a slip, wasn't it? Bad company ruins good morals. Those good morals, that good conscience that may have been trained, is going to get worn down and corrupted by those we surround ourselves with. The scriptures will not be mocked in telling us that. They're going to rub off on us. The scriptures tell us it's going to happen. Following the majority with our friends that aren't following God is just like following them right over that cliff or that bridge that I was asked if I would jump off with them, because the end will bring destruction on all of us. And I don't think that we will not find this in the scriptures, nor will we find it if we find ourselves in torment for eternity. I don't think we'll find the term misery loves company there. In fact, we would find just the opposite, because when we look at the story of the rich man and Lazarus, what did he say? "Send him to my brothers. I don't want them to come here." He wasn't wanting them. We won't find misery loves company. We won't be shoveling coal along with everyone else and just making a big time out of it. We're going to be there in hell, and there will be no comfort for us, even though there will be a lot of company. There's no passages that talk about us shoveling coal while we're in hell. But there are several that speak of eternal darkness and torment and wailing and discomfort and gnashing of teeth. But nobody's working shoveling coal or goofing off with their friends that they had fun with while they were on this earth in sin. But there are also some who put their trust in morality in their minister, their preacher, their teacher, their priest. Boy, we can see that on the news every morning right now, as we're going through the process, the tradition, the pomp of choosing a new pope. And what changes that's going to bring in the doctrine of the church because of his ideas. This new one that they bring in, that's unwise as well. Some reasons that these men of God can lead them astray are found in the scriptures. While I would never intentionally speak something that's incorrect, I am human. I can make mistakes. Don't tell Jenny I said that. I can make mistakes. I can understand something wrong. I can say something wrong. I could quote a scripture wrong. I could just be wrong on it. Everyone is human, but there are some who do this intentionally. They know what the scriptures say, but we're not going to practice that. We're not going to believe that. We're going to teach something different for whatever varied reason it might be. Maybe because our numbers have dwindled down to about 15. We got to get some more people in here. Well, we better change our message to attract more people. But notice what Paul said in Galatians chapter 1. If they were preaching something other than the original gospel, but it's outdated. It doesn't fit in this 21st century. If they're preaching something different, then it's no longer the gospel, is it? Or no longer the pure gospel. In Galatians chapter 1 and beginning in verse 6, he says, I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. That sounds pretty serious, doesn't it? And this wasn't even a full generation of time that had passed between them receiving the gospel and them already turning away from it. And Paul's saying, I can't believe it, how quickly it's happened. Don't change what's been given to you from the gospel, the truth. I was talking to a friend that happens, and I'm not harping on one particular religious group by any means, but there's a lot of them, and they have some very weird traditions, and he won't eat meat on a Friday. And I asked him one time during a certain time frame, and between Ash Wednesday and I guess it's Easter. Is that right, Tom? Between Ash Wednesday and Easter. And I said, where do you get that? Tell me where that scripture comes from. Because, I mean, if it's something that we should be doing, then I'll go to a fish fry. I don't like fish, but I'd go to a fish fry too. And his response was, well, the church tells me to do it. But there's no scripture for it? Why did the church tell you to do something that's not found in the scriptures? And what about all the other sins that we overlook during that time period, but we're not going to eat red meat? Where is that found in the scriptures? And we're following, and many people are following, and it happens not only in that religion, but in many others, and sadly in churches that were once standing for the truth, because we're not following the scriptures, we're following the man or the woman. How are we going to know if a false teacher is teaching in error if we don't know the gospel? And that's what Paul is telling them here. If you don't know what the gospel is, then somebody can come in and preach something that's just a little bit different, and you're going to follow it and be caught by it hook, line, and sinker, because you don't know what they're telling you is whether it's the truth or not. But there are warnings given for false teachers by Jesus, by Peter, by Paul. And Jesus said that the religious leaders were the blind leaders of the blind. In Matthew chapter 15, and beginning in verse 12. Matthew chapter 15 and in verse 12. Then his disciples came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? But he answered and said, every plant which my Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall in the ditch. They were offended. We hear that a lot too, don't we? With our feelings. I don't like how that sounds, so I'm going to be offended by it. Well, it doesn't matter if we're offended by the truth, we're just offended. And that's where it should stop. And Jesus said, leave them alone. They're just going to be offended. And they're going to follow each other right into the ditch. And what makes them blind? It's because they were not looking at the scriptures. He told them, you quote them, but they're the ones that are telling you that I am who I am. They're testifying of me, but you're too blind to see it. They were too busy following their traditions and their rituals. Yeah, and with the selection of the new pope and the color of smoke coming out of the chimney. They were talking on the news about what a tradition that was, and the rituals that went through that, and all of the stuff that they have to do to, I'm assuming they've still not selected it because I've not seen the color of the smoke coming out of the chimney yet, but all the traditions of man that they follow. Visualize that in our eye, what Jesus is describing. The blind leading the blind, and they're walking right into a ditch. And just a chain reaction, one right after the other, being pulled into it. And once they're in it, then it's too late. Well, they've already fallen in it. What are they going to do? I like watching some of those fail videos, and I probably laugh at some things that I shouldn't when I see them, but a lot of them are, how in the world can somebody be that silly to think that they can ride this little child's toy off the roof of their house and not break their neck? And it's funny. But in this instance, when we think about the blind leading the blind and going into the ditch, there's nothing humorous about that. They're going to fall, and their fall is into eternal punishment by following the man. And the last point that I'll leave us with, we shouldn't be surprised by this, because Paul tells us that they can be ministers of Satan. That's what they are. Following that man that is not following the Scriptures, and us not knowing the Scriptures. Well, who are we working for? Well, Satan. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and in verse 13. But would you think those who are preaching the truth, or those who aren't preaching the truth, do you think they would want to be, that would be offensive, wouldn't it, to be called a minister of Satan, and I'm working for him and I'm doing his bidding? But that's what false teachers are doing in essence. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and beginning in verse 13, he says, "For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ, and no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no greater thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works." That would be fighting words to accuse somebody and tell them, unless they're truly a satanic minister, if you said to them, "You're a minister of Satan," well, that would be conversation ender, wouldn't it? It'd probably make most people mad. But what does Paul say? When they're teaching false doctrine, and they can transform themselves into a disciple of Christ, into his apostles. But are we surprised? Satan did it too. And then we're going to follow them because we don't know the gospel and we've not studied. How important is actually teaching the truth? Well, I would say from these points, it's pretty important. And here's where we're going to leave off and pick up next week. We may be able to finish this lesson next Sunday morning. If not, we'll finish it next Sunday evening. But the Scriptures, and we're laying the groundwork for what we should be looking at. The Scriptures warn us about following the wrong source for morality and for guidance. And it tells us, don't follow your feelings because they can be wrong. Don't follow your conscience because it can be taught wrong and it can be telling you wrong. Paul was very well educated, highly educated for his day and time. And what did he do? Well, he was trying his best to destroy the Lord's church. He wasn't successful, but he tried. Don't follow your friends because the majority can be wrong. And don't follow somebody claiming to be a preacher or teacher or minister or pope or rabbi or whatever we want to call them, because they can be wrong as well. Follow the gospel and do what it tells us to do. If you're subject to the Lord's invitation, we take this time to think about our soul as we sing this song. I mean, hopefully we're doing that continually, but this is a time set aside for us to think about the condition of our soul. And if we don't have a relationship that's right with God, then we need to make corrections and take care of that now while we have the opportunity as we stand and sing.